Peace and blessings, peace and blessings. What's good, people? I mean, we just got finished listening to Dr. Umar Johnson. The brother's on to some really positive facts about, not necessarily positive, but some facts regarding the history of this country and um, how deliberate it was to single out the African American family or the African family in America and bring them to a point where the man is removed from the household and the woman is left alone to raise the child. I just want to go back. I want to go back. I want to do like a history timeline real quick. Um, as you know, my name is Seven G. Right now, I just want to, just go through a historical timeline, if you will, and try to cover some things that may be known but not known by many. In the inner city, currently, everybody knows I'm a former educator. Well, I still am an educator, but I don't work in the schools as of yet anymore. I retired recently, and in my experience, I've learned, I've witnessed actually that history is not really taught to African American students. And, right now we have a legislation in certain parts of America, including Florida, where you have governors like DeSantis who want to remove any history that makes the relationship between blacks and whites in this country look tainted, as if that may, in fact, point out certain things that might make one race appear as a blight. And I'm not referring to African Americans. So it's some of the truth is being blotted out of our schools systematically, and in inner cities, because they need funding from the government. The government has some say on what is taught in the classroom. So we have double periods or we'll see double periods of ELA and double periods of mathematics. And some people will argue that ELA can be the same as social studies, but it's not. I'll give you an example. So in the schools that I've been in the district that I've worked in, for the majority of my career, which is a quarter of a century, um, it's it's been believed that you can teach history by focusing on one person. Maybe Ida B. Wells. Let's take her for an example. And we know Ida B. Wells was involved in the anti-lynching campaign during the early 20th century. But we would not know what events inspired Ida B. Wells to be the type of woman that she is without understanding all of those historical events that happened prior to her. So history is not taught that way in school, wherein you can see that a historical timeline, if you will, how one event impacts another, or cause and effect. That would be the perfect way to say it. Cause and effect. A lot of students won't understand cause and effect. Therefore, they won't be able to prevent. Uh, the importance of understanding cause and effect is so that you would know, or in the future, you would understand the ideas that cause problems, as well as those ideas that help the society. So ideas that cause problems in society, and ideas that actually help society, are part of this cause and effect history. So let me go way back. I'm gonna go way back to, let's say, 1600s, feudal England. So understand that there's a social hierarchy during this time period in Europe, in England, and throughout Europe. Um, the economy basically functions on a feudal system where you have, at the lowest part of this pyramid, if you will, if you could see a pyramid, the lowest part of this pyramid, you have peasants. At the top, you have the king. So you have your king at the top, and you have your nobles, or the very wealthy people who have money and power, and they have that money and power because of the land that they own. All right. You have knights who are right underneath these nobles, and a lot of these knights can be given the position of knighthood depending on who wields the power. So it could be, of course, the king has some say, but the king is at the very top. You have the nobles are right underneath the king, the aristocracy. Then you have the the um the knights or the soldiers right underneath the aristocracy. Then underneath them you have your peasants. Now in the feudal system, if you were born a peasant, you remained a peasant. You were considered low born. And some of you Game what's it called? Game of Thrones. Some of you Game of Throne fans out there, you probably watched it. People being low born, high born, being born a bastard and stuff like that. That's very much part of that European culture from the medieval times. Um, so anyway, so if you were born a peasant, you remained a peasant. Nobles who had control over lands that peasants farmed, and believe me, these farmers were very much poor, even though they were growing crops. Much of the crops that they grew and they cultivated, harvested, they would have to give that to the nobles. The nobles, of course, would have to give what they had to the king. So the king, of course, got the most, and nobles had that, and whatever the peasants had was probably barely enough to make it through the winter many times. So um, they made sure that these peasants remained poor and in need of the nobles' protection. So these nobles who were granted lands that these peasants lived on were called landlords. You may have heard it or read it in books when you read about medieval times, how they referred to the wealthy as being lords. They were lords of the lands, throughout Europe. So the landlords had control over the peasants, who would never leave this class, this caste system, if you will, this where they're stuck living as poor people from the time they're born to the time they die. Okay, so now I want you to let's fast forward. Okay, thanks to people like Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and uh, um, Pizarro and Hernan Cortez, because of men like this, growing interest in the Western Hemisphere came out of Europe. And understand that there's a whole lot of things going on at this time period, this 17th century. Even prior to the 17th century, you had the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century, and you had people were actually being murdered in the street. This was considered to be purification if you weren't a practicing Catholic. If you were a Jew, a Muslim, any other religion other than Catholic, you were purified in the streets. If people found out that you were practicing Judaism or some other type of religion during the Spanish Inquisition, you were killed. You were burned alive. You were pinned to a stake or tied to a stake and burned alive in the town square so everyone could see you. So a lot of people wanted to get out of Europe, because of these things. Also in England, you had a growing Protestant movement. You had the Anglican Church, or the rise of the Anglican Church, and this is what causes the Pilgrims to want to leave Europe and come into North America. But by then, in the South, in Virginia, you had the establishment of the Virginia Company, all right, which primarily focused on cultivating and harvesting tobacco, which became one of the most highly sought after commodities that were being grown in the country. So you figure at this time, it's not yet America, okay? It's not the America that we know. Right now, they're just colonies, they're English colonies. It's considered New England, especially the part where the Pilgrims, the Pilgrims was really trying to find Virginia. They were trying to find a Virginia company. They got off course and they ended up landing in Plymouth Rock. Okay, which is Massachusetts, right? So they end up landing there. Of course, people know the story. They was burning down stuff, and the Indians came and taught them how to hunt and how to actually create fires so that they can actually cook without burning down the forest, how to hunt turkeys, how to eat, food from the land, how to harvest crops, cultivate and harvest crops on the land in that type of temperature and the type of things, the type of environment that they were living in. And then eventually they turn around and kill the Indians. The Indians, were giving, the natives of the country were giving, but when they saw how Europeans were not as respectful of land and nature as they were and were abusing the gifts that came from the creator, they wanted the Europeans to leave when they thought the Europeans were violating certain spiritual rights. I'm not going to go all into depth on this. This is all researchable. It's all things that you can look into. Okay, but the Europeans basically did not have the same ideas when it came to land and animals that Europeans did. I mean, that the indigenous did. The indigenous had an appreciation for the land, for the animals. Europeans did not. But anyway, when the Indians wanted the Europeans to leave, that term Indian giver comes out, right? Oh, you're going to help us now. This is how the European. Oh, you're going to help us now. You want to take it back? Well, of course, you're abusing it. Anyway, let's go back down to Virginia. Okay, we're talking maybe about 900 miles from where the Pilgrims end up landing, right? And so in Virginia, you have this Virginia company, and you have all of these white planters who, out of the feudal system in England, if you were a lord and you could pay your way under King Edward, I believe it was King Edward, check my facts on that. King Edward created the headright system. And under the headright system, any lord who could pay their way to the new world would get 50 acres of land. The king is just giving away land in North America like he owns it, you know. And, this is, you already understand how Europeans are, especially in that time period. If you can't defend what they want to take, then they'll take it. So this was the king's mentality, even in this time period. So they said, okay, if you could pay your way to North America, I'll give you 50 acres of land. And for each additional person that you bring with you to farm the land, I'll give you an additional 50 acres of land. Now, I want you to imagine this time period during feudalism where you have peasants who are just thirsty to be free. Now, they're of course, among the most uneducated people in Europe because they're peasants. They're not going to get the best education. They don't wear the best clothes. Excuse me, I have allergies and all that. Um, um, they don't wear the best clothes. They don't, they don't eat the best food. They don't live in the best environment. Just put it like this: the peasants are a part of the ghetto. Now we understand the mentality that sometimes poverty causes human beings to have, because you're dealing with despair so much. It may cause human beings to act desperate, to be more prone to crime, to stealing, anything that they can do to try to make ends meet. So now these peasants that the landlords have under their supervision, imagine being poor like that and being offered an opportunity to work as an indentured servant in the new world, which would be North America, and just work for about 7 to 10 years, and then you would be granted 50 acres of land yourself. Imagine that. Your own land after being a peasant your whole life. So I want you to fast forward, okay? Because some indentured servants suffered, and you're going to have people, people in here, trying to, well, what about the indentured servants? They live like slaves too. And yeah, many of them did. But understand, this all changes when the whole terms white and black come to fruition somewhere around the late 17th century, okay, and into the 19th century, you know. So for about 200 years, this whole term changes the whole dynamic of the way people see society. Anyway, so you have these landlords who are paying their way over, and they're bringing maybe 10 other workers with them to tobacco workers. You have maybe 100. I'm just throwing out numbers. I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm imagining it would be a lot of people, because eventually it becomes the English colonies, and everybody is being rewarded for going over to the new land and being able to farm it. Over a period of time, you got thousands and thousands of Europeans over here, each of them getting 50 acres of land, or additional. Because I mean, if the landlord pays his way over, he gets 50 acres. And for each additional person he brings, he gets another 50 acres. So if he brings 100 people, I mean, that's 500 acres of land, right? Or is that 5,000? Okay, yeah, that's 5,000 acres of land. You got 50 acres of land times 100. So you got like 5,000 acres of land. Now understand, 5,050 now, 5,050 acres of land from one lord. Now, what's happening is there going to be respect for the Indian lands? No, we learned from the whole thing with the Pilgrims. There's no respect for the Indians' lands, their rights, their spiritual rights, or anything that is indigenous. So conflicts ensue. You have the indigenous people fighting against the Europeans fighting to keep control of the land, and take control of the land. There's bitterness between both sides, but the numbers of Europeans continue to grow. And because they have superior firepower with weapons and guns, very much like today, because they have guns, they're able to do a lot. They're able to do a lot more. And unfortunately, they're able to commit more evil and take more of what they want because the indigenous didn't have guns, not until they begin trading with Europeans. And some of them begin betraying other indigenous people in order to protect themselves, protect their lands, protect their families. I mean, this is the nature of war, right? So people are trying to protect their families, so they become Christian and they decide to give up their lands. They decide to take on English names, and that's another story. The Carlisle Indian Industrial Group or School. That's another story. Well, let me go. Let me keep going. Let me stay on this timeline. All right, we're still around the 17th century. Okay, and you got now all these Europeans owning land. There's conflicts with Indians, and you got all of these Europeans with all of this land, but not enough laborers. But in Africa, slavery is going on already. Slavery had been going on. Slavery had been going on all over the globe. And this is where people get it confused, right? They'd be like, well, everybody was enslaved at some point. Why can't Africans pull themselves up? The slavery in America was very different than the slavery all over the world. However, the sub-Saharan slave trade, we saw some aspects of chattel. Chattel slavery built America. Chattel slavery may, in some facts, have built other communities, cities, and nations, and some. You know what? Actually, that's wrong. That's wrong. Check my facts on this. A chattel slave is a slave that is born a slave and dies a slave. You never can have freedom. In Africa, the slavery was more traditional. People who were slaves were debtors. They owed money, but they could still rise to a high standing in their society. They could still get married. They wouldn't be a slave for life. They weren't born a slave, and they didn't have to remain a slave for the rest of their life as long as they paid off their debt. Other slaves in Africa were prisoners of war. Of course, when people like Africans who have been living on the planet for millions of years, live together over a period of time, you have fights and feuds that take place. This is like Europe. It's no different. Europeans fighting Europeans look at it, just look it up and see all of the different wars that they've had against each other. Africans fought against each other. Asians have fought against the Mongolians and the Chinese, the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese and the Koreans, the Chinese and the Japanese, the Mongolians and all of them, the Ottomans who were Turkish, they fighting against the people of Saudi Arabia and forget all of the names of the groups, but you get the point. There's war all over. But the European had learned from the trans-Saharan slave trade, the sub-Saharan slave trade, how to conduct a transatlantic slave trade. And so because Africans were taking their prisoners of war in the beginning and selling them into slavery for guns so that they can fight against each other. And this is what happened. Africans were taking guns and giving prisoners of war to Europeans, who Europeans had a more imperialistic mindset, right? The Europeans had a vision that they could use the agency of slavery in order to build an empire, to extend their empires. I mean, England is about that big. Spain, Portugal, France, compared to the places that they've conquered, all with superior weaponry, all with a diabolical sense, intelligence, a diabolical sense or intelligence wherein they could subdue the rest of the world using the models of theology that they got out of Kemet, which eventually became Greek, eventually became Roman, and then became Catholic. And they use this same Catholic ideology in order to subdue the folks that they've conquered. So there's no puzzle to why the indigenous of the Caribbean tend to be Catholic. Ask them. Ask the people in Haiti and Cuba and Colombia, throughout South America. What is their primary religion? They'll say Catholic, because it was under that name that you have these conquests. When they conquered the indigenous, they brought that theological system with them. So understand, back in America now, you have all of this land being taken and the indigenous fighting against the Europeans, and this need for labor because all of these Europeans have taken all of the land. And Africans are selling other Africans at a cheap price. The Portuguese are using them to build up Brazil. The Spanish are using them to build up the Caribbean. They're all taking advantage of it. The French use it to, participate in the Caribbean, Haiti. The English begin to figure, hey, we could do the same thing. Everybody else is buying slaves from Africa. Why not us? So in 1619, the first Africans are brought to North American shores. Now, this is the part most people don't get, is that there were already Africans living in the country prior to Europeans coming here, who had been here for thousands of years. They're brown-skinned people, the indigenous people, the same people who designed the pyramids in Egypt had civilization in North America thousands and thousands of years before Europeans even knew the world was round. Look it up, not making it up. All right. Remember, this is brief. I'll go in more depth with that, and hopefully I'll have some guests in the future who can delve in with their professional ideologies and their professional scope on the history and the facts of history that point out these very same facts that I'm trying to give you right now. Africans were already here, and you can even look at Webster's dictionary, 1828 version of his dictionary. When you look up American, he describes a copper-skinned person, copper-skinned people who were living on this continent when Europeans got here. Now, I don't know if you noticed this, but copper is brown. So there were brown-skinned people already here. I mean, you could look at the Olmec civilizations. You could look at their features. All right. There's a whole history of our people that have been buried, and that's another story. So anyway, you have all of these Africans being brought to North America to help out with the tobacco farms, to help Europeans build up North America. Eventually, sugar and rice and cotton and all of these things that Africans cultivate and harvest for the European for free, under the gun, under the whip, the cracking of that whip. That's where that word cracker comes from. Under the cracking of that whip, under the gun. You get all of these Africans working for hundreds of years, from 1619, 1719, 1819, free every day, except for Sunday. Now, I mean, there was some work on Sunday, but Sundays was when you were brought in for your theological indoctrination. And if you were allowed to step foot in the church, you had to stand in the back while the white people sat down. And they would begin to tell you, like in Ephesians 6:5, slaves, be obedient to your masters as if you were obeying Christ. They wouldn't allow you to read because you would read certain things in the scriptures that would contradict some of the things that you were being taught by them. The fear of you having knowledge. So reading was forbidden for slaves. And I want you to understand, like from the very beginning, in order to keep this rigid economic system together, Europeans knew that you had to make a system of slavery. So in order to do that, you had to declare Africans as aliens. Give you a quick story. Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was a black man who lived in this country during the early 1600s. He was a slave to a white man who had a 250-acre plantation. Anthony Johnson helped his master. Okay, this is before chattel slavery. Okay, Anthony Johnson helped his master until his master died. His master left him the estate, which wasn't unusual I mean, this happened with even, in 1865 when the Civil War ended, some slavers left their plantations to African farmers or former African slaves. But in Anthony Johnson's case, he ends up inheriting the 250-acre plantation. But I want you to imagine 250 acres is like 250 football fields of farmland. Can one man do that on his own? Now, at a time where it was common, and we just, as I mentioned earlier, we just talked about it. Slavery is all over the world. Some people would sell themselves into slavery in order to have a place to live, in order to have food. They would say, "I'll work. I'll be your slave. Just let me work here with you." It wasn't chattel slavery where someone owns you, your property. You're born a slave and you die a slave. It wasn't chattel slavery. Okay. Anthony Johnson, when his master died and he owned that, earned that, or inherited the 250-acre plantation, he had a few slaves and he had indentured servants. So you'll hear some people be like, "Well, hey, what about this black man who had a slave?" You don't understand. It was at a time when people needed workers to handle these large estates. And yeah, if you could buy a worker, if you had 250 acres of land and you had the money, you would buy a worker too. If you had 250 acres of land and you were willing to give away 25 or 50 and give 25 to two, 125 to one person, 25 to another, you might have some indentured servants. It just makes sense. It makes it a lot easier to maintain a living because the way you maintained a living back then was through agrarian work. You grew crops, cash crops. Fast forward though, and you know how greedy man is. We have evidence of it today. They want more money. So with more money, you need more workers. You need more land. More land means you need to conquer more. You need to kill more. This is real. You need to have more workers. So you need to have more slaves. So at one point, it got to be like there were 10 Africans to every one European. So contrary to what people hear, there were a lot of slave revolts. I understand nobody wants to be in bondage. It wasn't like Africans were like, "Oh yes, I love to be a slave. Yes, I love this. Oh master, can I help you out? Can I help you?" It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. I mean, you did have some Africans who actually loved their masters. Now, I'm not saying that this didn't happen because you did have masters who were more like an Anthony Johnson. I just need workers. And we can all eat if we all work. But I own you. And when you're done, maybe you could get this land, but you're my slave for now, not for life. Go ahead, get married. But no, chattel slavery is like this. You can't get married, not unless I arrange it. And I want to arrange a marriage, not even a marriage. I want to arrange copulation between this big, strong black man here and this thick black woman here. And I want them to make a couple babies for me so I can sell these. See, that's different. Imagine the psychology of that. Imagine what that does to a child to see their parent go through that. Imagine what it does to a child who's forced to copulate with a man she doesn't want to be with, or a male being forced to copulate with a girl he doesn't want to be with. Maybe he doesn't want to be with a girl. Imagine the psychological trauma and then having no reprieve, no one to counsel you after that. And this is going on all over for hundreds of years. Today, when someone is raped or trafficked off or something like that, they get all types of intensive counseling. People want to make sure they don't kill themselves. There were things put in place to make sure slaves didn't kill themselves, all the way back to the huge nets they used to build on the side of slave ships to stop slaves from jumping overboard when they were brought up to exercise after having to sit in tight, hot quarters, no air conditioning on the salty sea, no food, starving, dead bodies, rats, urine, feces, vomit, laying all around you, having to smell that on the hot sea. Many people dying, being pushed overboard, folks losing their minds trying to jump overboard, and the slavers would build these nets to catch them if they went overboard and bring them back on so that they can endure the terror. So the strongest of those people who survived that journey were us. Some of us, anyway. Some of us were indigenous. But back to my story. Not my story, the story. History, not his story. The story that they tried, the real history that they're trying to suppress. You got all of these Africans now outnumbering whites, and you have slave revolts. The Seminole Nation, Seminole means runaway. The Seminole Nation, the Invincible Army, consisted of indigenous and Africans who were slaves because the enemy of their enemy was their friend. This war between the Seminoles, I believe, you can check my facts on this, from 1712 into the 1800s. Some battles the Europeans or the American military won. Well, at least they ran them off. They forced them out of their civilizations that they had built up. But you know how relentless slavers are. They would keep hunting the Seminoles and keep losing men. You had the Stono rebellions. You had 21 slave rebellions. You had other ways of rebellion too, like Harriet Tubman in the 19th century. But the 1808 rebellions in Haiti, which they're still paying for today, by the way, inspired other Africans throughout the Western Hemisphere to revolt and rebel against their masters. Now, I want you to imagine there's 10 Africans, because of this greed, there's 10 Africans to every one white person. How many white people, families are being killed? But remember, they have superior weaponry. They got the guns. And this, how guns are very important today. This is one of the reasons that they have this Second Amendment to keep you in check. I mean, a lot of us want to believe that it's only about, the British and, because we had to protect ourselves from the British who come in. But, you had Africans here who were revolting, and everybody felt that they needed to have a gun in their house. Overseers, that word overseer becomes officer later on. But the overseers had their dogs very much like they do today, and they would be stationed around huge plantations, and they had ways of communicating with each other to put down slave rebellions. Slave quarters were very much like the projects today. They were surrounded by white communities, you know. So if you did try to, escape, you had, I don't mean communities, but you had stations where overseers were, where they could quickly be summoned and encircle the potential threat. But because you had all of these Africans who were living here, and they outnumbered Europeans, there was this growing fear. And this fear continues all the way up through the 19th century, you know. And around the 19th century, especially 1850s, the Statue of Liberty is built. And then check this out. Now, the original Statue of Liberty was it follows the 1807, 1808, the ending of the transatlantic slave trade, which only compelled North Americans, white Americans who were living here now, to have a second Middle Passage, where more Africans were traded across state lines to other planters illegally, by the way. Sometimes they were kidnapped. In the case of Solomon Northup, I believe that was 1828. I think it was 1828. Solomon Northup was kidnapped from Saratoga, New York, and he was brought into the plantations of Louisiana. And he spent 12 years as a slave, as a chattel slave. And he endured the horrors before he was able to, luckily, get back home to his family by the help. He got some help from a white abolitionist, by the way. When some whites, especially in the North, the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, you had a lot of white Americans. Remember, we're going to talk about this word white and black. You had these white Americans who saw the horrors of slavery, including people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she described the horrors of slavery. And it actually moved the hearts of many Europeans, and it made them come up with a movement to end the chattel slavery in North America. Now, understand, this is like 1850s. All right, slavery had been outlawed in 1807, 1808, but this country insisted on keeping chattel slaves because there was so much money being made from free labor. 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. So this war, the Civil War, it takes place and all of that. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But you have this need to try to balance out the ratio of 10-1. Eventually becomes 4-1, and eventually it reverses. It becomes 4-1 white people to black people, 10-1 white people to black people, due to this influx of Europeans. Bring me your tired, huddling masses yearning to be free. I don't know the whole quote, but the Statue of Liberty was given to this country by the French, and it was really a black woman breaking chains. And if you go to the original Statue of Liberty, I mean, not the original, because that was the original with the black woman breaking the chains. You go to the one today, and you can still see the shackle on her foot. That was the original one. That was the one that was supposed to be. Go there. Don't get mad. Oh, man, he's talking this stuff. Go see. Go see. Go to the Statue of Liberty and look at the shackle on her foot. It was a symbol that meant free the indigenous people, free the Africans, stop slavery. I think really, I don't want to, don't get it twisted that these Europeans had a heart all of a sudden for Africans, because they didn't. They just saw that America needed to catch up with the rest of the world, who had begun industrializing and didn't need manual labor so much like they did before. Now you had the cotton gin in the South. I think it was, oh man, I want to say 1794 when the cotton gin was created. I might be off. But now it could pick the seeds out of cotton instead of human beings doing it, which took a longer time. And if you saw 12 years a slave, imagine, you see how light cotton is. Now, if you saw 12 years a slave and you know their history, they had to pick 200 pounds of cotton in a day, every day, on these huge plantations. Now, in order to pick 200 pounds per slave, that it's got to be a whole lot of land, right? And a whole lot of cotton to a harvest. And it takes a whole lot of slaves to be able to pick 200 apiece. And then these bales of cotton would be sold to manufacturers, who would then turn this cotton into textiles. But the African slave got nothing. So Europeans who were coming over here wanted to be guaranteed that they would be safe. So the more Europeans that came over, whether they were German, whether they were Polish, Austrian, Swedish, or Dutch, Norwegian, British, or English, French, Portuguese. I mean, all of these people became known as white people. This became the name for them, even though when they came over, they were fighting each other. Many of them were, because there were language barriers. But over a period of time, once the language barrier subsides and everyone has the same kind of skin, they became known as white people. Now, if you look up white means innocent, pure, honest, blemish free, etc., stuff like that. Trustworthiness. Black is gloomy, wicked, sullen, violent, sinister. This becomes our name. Now, you could look at me. My skin is brown. So where did the black skin come from? It came from what I'm telling you. And this becomes what they use to establish not establish, already the racial system is established. This kind of exacerbates it, if you will. This perpetuates it. So now it encapsulates it, perhaps. I don't know. I'm not finding the right term, is escaping me. But now, on top of you having this social hierarchy where the slave now is just like the peasant was in feudal England, and the former peasant is now like the king was in feudal England. And then you have these terms, white and black, to define these groups. It becomes a very rigid caste system. So after the Civil War, now I understand the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln in 1862 wanted to emancipate Africans. First off, understand the North was being mostly led by the ideas of abolitionists who were funding Lincoln when he had his victory against Douglas in his second term. A lot of white planters did not want Lincoln to win the presidency because it meant that the potential end to slavery. And just like people want to hold on to their guns and their fancy cars, and people wanted to hold on to their slaves. When the South or Southern states seceded from the Union, they wanted to call themselves the Confederates. And they did. They became the Confederates with the X flag and the stars and all of that. They were the ones who wanted to keep slavery. This is why a lot of people find that flag to be extremely racist, kind of like a Nazi flag, because that flag represents those people who wanted to keep people who look like me in bondage. And a lot of people can't understand that. Like, what are you talking about? I'm proud of my flag. I'm proud of my flag. It's like, we don't expect certain folks to get it. We don't. It's just that some people are just born not to. But that flag has its history in America with those people called Confederal, the Confederates who wanted to keep slavery, and the North was the Union who wanted to restore the Union. This is why they called themselves the Union Army. They wanted to restore the Union. I'm not going to say they wanted to end slavery, because they didn't. Lincoln's Union Army, the one that's being charged with winning the war to restore the Union between the Confederates and the rest of the nation, this Union Army was losing. They were getting their behinds whooped. And part of the reason they were getting their behinds whooped was because they were able to prepare a lot faster. They were able to mobilize a lot quicker. And one of the reasons the South was able to mobilize a lot quicker is because they had slaves. It's a lot of work. Think about this time period. You didn't have tractors and things of that sort. Men had to do the manual labor themselves. You had to dig the trench yourself. Now, I don't know if anybody has dug anything with a shovel, but if you try to dig something, you try to dig anything over an hour, just think about digging for an hour with a shovel into the dirt, hard rocks and stuff like that. Shovel, man, you're going to be tired. You're going to feel like fighting after that. Feel like running and getting your guns and going to war and battle with somebody, and man, you're going to be fatigued. So the South had slaves to do all those things. So they were mobilizing quicker. They were able to they were able to prepare faster for battle than the North was, and the North was getting wiped out. So when Lincoln freed the slaves, he initially he wanted to free the slaves by deportation. So many Africans were being freed from Southern states in rebellion during the Emancipation Proclamation. That's what it was. I'm sorry. Let me go back. 1862. He wanted to deport us to places like Haiti and Liberia. Okay, this is why Liberia became a colony of the United States. Because of course, yeah, you let those Africans free, but you still want to control them. Other Africans were deported to places like Haiti. Okay. The Africans who were still in the North were still slaves. Africans in the South, and during the 1864, 1865 Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln freed the slaves in states of rebellion, those slaves, many of them, ran away from their plantations. The men ran away from their plantations to go and fight in Lincoln's army. They wanted to find Lincoln's army and join in the fight. Now, understand, Lincoln wasn't even thinking about using African soldiers until Frederick Douglass got in his ear and said, you should let these Negro soldiers fight for their freedom. That will change the tide of the war. And it did. The Africans who would become known as contraband because they were property and they had escaped the South to join the Union Army effort to win the war. a war which Lincoln was only going to free the slaves in the South, but Frederick Douglass got in his ear, and the abolitionists of the North got in his ear. These white abolitionists, the Quakers, got in his ear and said, this has to be a war about freeing all the slaves. You can't just free the ones in the South who had fought without freeing them all. And then with their valiant effort in the war and changing the tide of the battle, Lincoln granted them their freedom. So some people argue that the Africans freed themselves from slavery with the battles with the Seminoles, the several slave revolts, the success that African soldiers, chattel, escaping from chattel slavery of the South, contraband, joining in the Union Army effort and changing the tide of the battle. They would say that Africans freed themselves. Whites had no intention on freeing Africans. So with the Emancipation Proclamation came the 13th Amendment. Now, if you go back and read the 13th Amendment, these are the three amendments I'm about to talk about: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. The 13th Amendment freed Africans. And I can quote it a little bit. It's neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime wherein the party have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Something like that. So you couldn't be a slave unless you were convicted of a crime. 13th Amendment, 1865 Emancipation Proclamation, that ushered in the 13th Amendment. But the loophole, you couldn't be a slave unless you were convicted of a crime. Okay. The 14th Amendment gave Africans who were slaves in the country citizenship, because even though you were born here as chattel, you were not considered a citizen. You were, I believe it's 3/5 of a human being. So the European was a complete human being. That's what the star is. The 5 parts of the star. You only 3 points of that star. You only 3/5. They're the whole star. So since you only 3/5 of a human being before, the 14th Amendment now supposedly made you a complete citizen. The 15th Amendment gave you the right to vote. Black men, not women. White women couldn't even vote yet. They didn't get that right until 1920. Thanks to people like Alice Paul and Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'm not Harriet Beecher Stowe. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I forgot Howell's first name. But these women who Europeans, and Ida B. Wells, because it was primarily a European woman's fight to have, because she had been marginalized by her own men, the patriarchy that we talk about today. It was them. Since they were in England, feudal Europe, women weren't even allowed to speak up in Europe. Check out the story of Salem's Lot, and not Salem's Lot. What is it? Forgot. Salem witch trials. I think that's what it is, and how women were perceived. European women who spoke out against the government, the types of punishment. Research it. See what type of punishment they would get. Okay. So I digress. So the 13th Amendment loophole ushers in a new age, the free African. And you did have men in places like in the South Carolina, and the Carolinas in particular, African men who joined Congress. Some of them real tough guys too, man. Smart, brilliant, smart Black men. I forget the incident where I think it was 200 of them were killed on the steps by white racists who didn't like the idea of Black men being in positions where they were responsible for legislation. But with this new 13th Amendment loophole ushered in a new time period where you would have Black codes. So in the South, they issued these Black codes which were laws that severely limited the rights of African Americans, anyone who was indigenous or brown skin. Severely limited your rights, meaning you couldn't hang out, you couldn't be assembled without permission. You couldn't be near white towns. You couldn't buy a home in a white town. Um, uh, you name it, man. If I mean, you could be arrested as young as 12 to 13 years old. And you go back, look at some of the images in the collage at the beginning of this episode, where you'll see young boys in their stripes, their prison stripes, on a chain gang. So they begin to lock black men and black boys up for minor offenses, not even offenses, just being a vagrant, assembling, being too close to white folks, not looking down, you looking them in the eyes when you're talking to them, anything they could lock you up for. But the what they were doing, they were exploiting the loophole to force Africans to build the South back up, and that's why it was primarily happening in depth. I mean, there were terroristic acts being done to Africans in the South in order to enforce this idea of white supremacy. So you had not just the black folks getting locked up. The type of work that Africans could do was to farm. So many of them became sharecroppers. Now, in order to be a sharecropper, of course, you needed to work on someone's land. Well, whose land was you going to work on? The land is all owned by white folks. So in some cases, you did have Africans who were able to inherit what their slavers had left them. And some of them were able to prosper and do well. They had to look toward each other. They couldn't look to anybody else. Jim Crow had existed, segregation, whites only. The blacks are locked out. They have no choice but to turn toward each other to help each other out. The Freedmen's Bureau was established in order to help Africans who were former slaves to adjust to life outside of slavery. The church was involved. The church was one of the first places that Africans can go to get an education, mathematics, language arts, history, you know? But what eventually happens is the Freedmen's Bureau becomes sort of like it evolves into what becomes known as a welfare system. Okay. System designed to help those who are trying to stop themselves from becoming indigent, homeless, extremely poor. Only thing about this system during the time of black men getting locked up and being lynched during black codes and sharecropping, and understand sharecropping too. Sharecropping, you were on a white planter's land. You had to rent the white planter's tools, so you had to pay for that. You had to give a portion of the crops that you cultivated and harvested from your land, while also cultivating and harvesting crops from his land. But you had to do his land first before you did your own. So oftentimes you didn't have much time to do your own. And because you were borrowing tools from him, and if you broke a tool, you had to pay for it, you remained in debt, and it was another form of slavery. Check it out, PBS special, Channel 13, Slavery by Another Name. It goes into depth about the sharecropping, slavery by another name. It does that. Check it out. Okay. So you have at the early or late 19th century, early 20th century, you have men like Booker T. Washington advocating for blacks to utilize these skills that we have, that white folks will respect, being a servant, you know, sharecroppers, uh, waiters, waitresses, butlers, and turn them into businesses. Have your own business where people will call on you for your service to clean their house, to cut their lawns, to farm their lands, and they'll pay you for that, which is a brilliant idea. This is an idea that we should have look, if you gotten away from it, if we did, and I believe we kind of did, because after Booker T. Washington, you start getting W.E.B. Du Bois and a new idea of, in order for us to be seen as equals to the white man, we need to be able to compete with them intellectually. And so the talented 10% of the African American population could be perceived as elites, the smartest group, the highest group intellectually, you know. And from this highest group intellectually, we could create fraternities, much like Europeans did, sororities that come later on, you know. These elite of smart, intelligent black folks who could sit at the table with Europeans, their brightest scholars, and compete with them on an intellectual level, so that we would be able to sit on those Senate floors and those Congress floors and lobby for our rights and the privileges that should be due to us, just like any other American citizen, according to the 14th Amendment. But we're still combating the Jim Crow. We're still combating black codes in the South. We're still combating the racial turmoil of the South, the terrorist acts of lynching that are running rampant throughout the South. Still enduring those things, still having a civil rights movement that takes place from 1864 up until 1964. So for 100 years after slavery, Africans are still struggling in this country to be considered real Americans, to really be free. So in lieu of that, you have this African man who feels responsible that he has to protect his family. Now, were all African men like this after slavery? No. Were all African women family oriented after slavery? No, man. You have many of us during slavery who were on sex plantations. So whatever your talent was during slavery, whatever you were used for during slavery, became your primary choice of occupation. So if you were a prostitute, you probably were a prostitute. If you were a pimp or a thug, you probably were a pimp or a thug. If you were a mandingo fighting, you were probably going to end up fighting. If you were a criminal or used to do criminal things, you were probably going to do criminal things. If you were the type of person who was cooking in the house, you're probably going to want to cook in the house. You get the point. Slavery was an institution in this country. That's what makes it so much different than the other types of slavery that went on throughout the world's history. You were chattel. From the time you were born and could understand the English language, you were a slave till the time you died. And everything you did had to be within that institution's guidelines. Look down, don't look up. You can't read a book. All these rules. And you had to teach your children that. Pray on Sunday, that Jesus is your Lord, the white man's your Lord, the white man's your God. You had to do that. If you didn't, you were beaten, man. It got to a point where we didn't, the slavers didn't have to raise and crack that whip. Where we just gave it to our children. Of course, Africans, you know what we do when we get theology and things like that. We worship the Creator in the way that feels best to us. And that's where you get these Baptist churches, the African Episcopal, AME, African Methodist Episcopalian churches, And that all started in the Caribbean. That's another story. That's a revolution that went on down there. They were dealing with their own plights. But they are also, they're part of our race. And even though people don't see it like that today, it's just that they were in a different area geographically. And so the experiences were different because of the geographical differences, and the legislative differences based on whoever were the colonizers. All right. So fast forward, W.E.B. Du Bois establishes the Divine Nine and the talented 10th, and the top 10% of the African population in North America become a part of these elite groups who begin to sit at the table with Europeans and can now feel like intellectual equals with them. But how far did that get us? During the early 1900s, 20th century, you have Africans who are on welfare. And it makes me think about Malcolm X's story. If you ever read his book, and he goes into depth about how his mother, a social agency, broke up their family because his father was killed by racism. And then his mother was left to raise the children by herself. And I think it was 6 of them. So she had 6 children. She was by herself. She was poor. She had no job. She had no money. And she collected from the government. So, I mean, they would get, I think it was rice and flour they would get every year. Malcolm mentioned something not for sale on the bags. He thought that was the name of a brand, but it was what the government was giving poor people, so that they would have food now. Excuse me. So ultimately, Malcolm's, after his father is killed by white racists, and then his mother is basically driven to insanity, and she loses all the children. He ends up in a foster home. He goes to school. That's just one example I think about. Think about that movie Claudine. If you ever seen Claudine with James Earl Jones and Diane Carroll. I love that movie. I didn't want to watch it for a long time. I didn't know much about it. But then I got an opportunity to check the film out, sat and watched it one day. And it was a great story. It was a great story. Check it out. Claudine, James Earl Jones, and Diane Carroll. It's about the early 70s and how if a woman who was on welfare had a man in the house, her welfare was taken from her. So in the film, you'll see her like when the welfare agents come to see what she's doing in the house to inspect to make sure that their money from the government is being used, or maybe they're coming to check to see if she's still poor and they hope she's still poor or whatever. If she had a man in the house, they would take everything from her that the government was assisting her with. So when they came to the house, she had to hide the toaster, she had to hide the TV, she had to hide all of these things that would make it appear that she had some type of luxury in the house. She had to look poor, rotten, downtrodden, and then they would come in, they would be like, oh, okay, all right, this is good. It got to a point when she got so sick of the agency coming in, making sure she had no man in the house, that she said, yeah, I got a man. And here, yeah, and I got toasters too. And I got this. She just started pulling all these things out. She basically told welfare to kiss her ass because the welfare agencies, since their onset, have been designed to keep the black man out of the home. There are other things that work to keep the black man out of home. I already gave you one. The black codes, which singled out black men for minor offenses, not even offenses, and locked them up for menial causes and put them in prison for 10 to 20 years, all to build up the South. That's one. The welfare system, keeping the black man out the house. The black man couldn't find work. What skills did he have? And it was strategic not to hire a black man who wanted to take care and protect his family because it makes him look less than a man. Very much like the Willie Lynch letter. And I don't know if you guys know about the Willie Lynch theory and the psychology behind it, but it goes right along with this. So a lot of people want to debunk the letter and they want to act like it didn't happen. All right. 1712, apparently, there's a Willie Lynch letter to the planters in the Caribbean who were having trouble controlling their slaves. And in summary, what the letter talked about was the psychology of how to make a slave. And you start by breaking the woman. And the way you break the woman, this is Willie Lynch now. It ain't just me. Go read it before people go, oh, what are you talking about? You go read it first. Okay, read. Reading is fundamental. Remember that commercial riff? Reading is fun. Read. The Willie Lynch letter. Break the African woman. The breaking process of the African woman is that you had to make her fearful of depending on the black man. So the way you do that is you took the biggest, strongest black man, you tar and feather him. You take the other one and you whip him almost to the point of death. The one that is tarred and feathered, you set him on fire. After tying his limbs to the horse, to 4 different horses, you slap the horses and they pull off and rip them into pieces. And you have all of the children watch, all of the black children watch. You have all of the black women watch. And you speak those spells to them. If you ever do what this nigga did, this fear of the white man sets in. To the point where the black woman says to her baby, oh, baby, just say you're a Christian. Just say you're a Christian. I don't want the master to hit you. Oh, shoot. Baby to a boy. Oh, baby boy, just look, master, I'll whoop him. I'll whoop him. I'll whoop him. I just don't want the master to whoop him because he might not live. I'd rather spank them. So black folks started spanking their kids. Still do it to this day. Some will use extension cords. I remember this situation with Adrian Peterson whipping his child to the point when he had whelps and blood on his legs, and he thought that's just how it's supposed to be. Now, I don't know where Adrian Peterson is from, but I believe he's from the South. And there's reasons why northern children are a little different than southern children, and that may be another topic too. But understand, this Willie Lynch letter made the black woman so fearful for her life that she would raise her daughter to be independent and not to depend on a man after seeing what happened to black men who are strong and rise up to protect their families, get whipped, beat to death, pulled apart, set on fire, locked away, put in cages so birds can feed on, starved to death, penises cut off. All of this stuff happened to black men trying to protect their families. Like Dr. Umar Johnson just said, we were getting married during slavery. We were jumping the broom. Black men were protectors of the family. Not all of them, of course, like I said, the sex plantations and things like that, we have some. But for the most part, yeah. There was a sense that black men and women needed to be together. All we had was each other. And so through the welfare system, you have the same kind of thing happening. You have black men who cannot get work. He's looked at as less than a man in the woman's eyes. Imagine a man. I just want you to picture. I have this scenario in my mind, and I'm sure it happens somewhere, probably lots of times. But a woman who, in this time period, her only occupation was she knew how to cook, she knew how to clean, because that's what her mother did, and maybe that's what she did on the plantations, in the master's house. So that's all she knows how to do because that's all her mother knew how to do, and she does it well. So she can get a job working in some affluent European's house, right? She could get a job. And when she goes to get this job, she has to deal with sexual harassment, abuse, and things like that. Then she comes home to a man who still doesn't have a job, and she got to raise the kids, and she still got to cook for him. She's stressed out. See A Long Walk Home by Whoopi Goldberg. Imagine how stressed out it would be for this brother and this family when he can't provide. How less of a man he feels. Arguments ensue. Divorce starts to take place. The man is out the house again. So what Dr. Umar Johnson had to say bears a lot of merit. It has a lot of truth to it. And we need to consider how systematically, since the times of slavery, Europeans in this nation have been seeking to destroy the black family by removing the male, whether it be prison, whether it be death, whether it be by diminishing his role as a provider. The goal has always been to remove the black male. And by doing so, you hurt the black children. You create an imbalance in the household. And this is what we're seeing the prevalence of today. Imbalance in the household. What is the solution? Do we start in the schools? The schools should be able to provide something, right? But after Brown versus the Board of Education victory, and they desegregated schools, even though they're more segregated today than they have been in the past, and they especially in states like New Jersey, look it up. New Jersey, more more segregation in the schools in New Jersey, probably more than any other state in the northern region and this northeast region. Check it out. But you're still dealing with this population of African American males and females who don't know what it's like to have a man. They have in their home. They have confused ideas of what it means to be a man or manhood and womanhood. So the schools have to step up, but they won't, because since the merging or the desegregation of schools, we've had to allow the wolf to give the sheep, who are us, the education that we have to give to our kids that causes them to become victims to the wolf later on in life. And we trust in the wolf. And even if we don't, many of us feel that we have to rely on this wolf in order to provide us with the finances. the means to be able to educate our own. Ah, it's sad, man, because even way back in Africa in ancient times, people saw how we would fight against each other and could not unite in order to do something that was right for the entire race of brown people. In Africa, the diversity killed us. People took advantage of it. In this country, they made us afraid of unity. And because we don't unite, they continue to do what they do. They continue to divide and conquer. And today, a lot of this division is in the form of words like misandrist, misogynist. We have a lot of African American women today who cannot stand black men. We have a lot of black men today who cannot stand black women. Do you see that in the Chinese community? What about the Puerto Rican community? Even though they are part of the diaspora, they exist because of the Columbian exchange, right? Many of the Caribbean people do, due to that Columbian exchange and Hernan Cortez. But how about the European women? How about the Asian women? Do they talk that way about their men and the men talk that way about their women? Ask yourself, why us?